Okay. So what are the session objectives? We will go through what is policy, a general introduction, a few words on policy analysis, an understanding of policy development, but I'm not really focusing on how governments develop policy or how policymakers develop policy, but more on how we develop a policy critique and how do we organize interventions for a policy change. I won't spend too much time on semantics of definition. We all have a gut feeling of what policy is. But to ensure we are on the same page, policy is what governments do. It's also used sometimes for institutions. For example, we will say that WHO has a policy that a director general has only 2 terms. But largely, we are talking of institutions with authority, and largely we talk in the nation of government policy or global policy or the policy of a province. So a policy is a statement of a principle and a plan to guide discussions to achieve specific goals or objectives. That's the scope of the policy. But policies have 2 other characteristics. They necessarily have to be authorized by somebody. There is somebody who is an owner. There is somebody who says that this policy is something that we've declared. And the second characteristic is it is applicable to a jurisdictional area. It could be a nation. Most commonly we encounter in nations, but it could be a province. It could be an institution and the areas it controls. It could be a global policy. But even then, it would be only to people who have signed on and agreed to be part of the policy. So essentially, a policy is a document, but it has a scope, an authorization, and a jurisdictional area. I mean, that's a tongue twister. World Health Organization has a definition of the policy, the decisions, plans, actions undertaken to achieve specific healthcare goals within a society by a set of institutions or organizations. That's okay. I mean, basically, this is same page. We are just to get going on the same page on that. Then now some things about policy. Very often in the technical language and discussion about policy, it becomes very depoliticized. It looks like a technical area, and some area which people have called as governmentality, reducing it to something that administrators and planners and academicians do. But policy is essentially about power and politics. It is the balance of different interests of different stakeholders. But stakeholders doesn't mean that they all sit around the table with equal power. Some people have all the power and others have very little of it. And there is some degree of interest, or a policy represents a certain balance of power. Because most governments are governments of which act in the interests of the powerful, policies tend to favor the rich and privileged. And that's something that when it may be because of the influence of multinational corporations, that is transnational, that is across outside the nation. It could be by the military, especially in Southeast Asia. The military is a big player in any policy making. There are countries where you cannot make a policy without a sign off from the military. It could be the elite in bureaucracy. It could be large landowners, for example. So there are different sources who dominate the making of policy. But even where they are dominant, and I have written in the note, even where there is a dictatorship, they need something called legitimacy. By nature, the state has to appear as neutral. You cannot say that this policy is in favor of this big multinational conglomerate, or that corporate owner. It has to appear as on behalf of the people, on behalf of all the population. And therefore, policies need and provide legitimacy. That's a very important. So it's not power operating in a vacuum. It is negotiated power. And in this negotiation, people have power. And the stronger their voice, the more organized they are, the more informed they are, the more they have power on that. So policy is constructed with the people, even in the absence of formal participation. Obviously, where the balance lies will differ depending upon the power that people can exercise. And in this, evidence is power. You have a lot of this talk going about evidence-based policy making. Yes, evidence is important, but you can see the priority I have given it. It's one of the factors, but evidence can strengthen people's voices and shift the policy discourse because policies need legitimacy. They need to be seen as scientific, they need to be as truth, they need to be seen as all the people's interests. And therefore, evidence is power that can be brought to the table. But there's a tricky side of it. It's not as if the rich, if they are, for example, promoting patents and knowledge monopoly, they would not say that it is in their profit interest. They would legitimize it by saying, only if we have this scope can we innovate. And they bring some sort of evidence or some sort of a rationale or argument to support this. This constructs what is called a discourse, a way of talking about the topic, which is dominated by them, and therefore many beliefs of people or understanding or gut feeling about policy is actually constructed as form of manufacturing consent. So policies are preceded and backed by a public discourse. I was at Harvard once when they were telling me how they succeeded in changing policy in China, and they actually spelled out how an intellectual regime has to be created that favors the change of policy. There is a recent article in the Lancet, which we were discussing in our thematic circle last time, which is doing that. It is trying to construct a public discourse that will encourage a shift of policy that is corporate, but at some point it finds its own legitimacy. So evidence is a two-edged sword, but if we understand it as evidence, it depends on how you understand it. If you understand evidence as truth-telling and truth to power, then it is people's power. But if it can be used to shape a discourse. So I think when we understand policy, it is good to get policy as politics right. And I think this is the important message that we would have to say on that. Now, let me take one example. Let us take the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. You can click on it in the PowerPoint I've sent to you, but you don't need to. Let me take on this. Now this is a policy, but this is an act. All policies are not acts, but this is a treaty. This is an agreement, which means it is binding. It is adopted in 2003 and in force from 2005, and about 183 countries have signed on. Who is its custodian? Who made the policy? Who monitors it? Who owns it? It is the World Health Organization. At your country level, who is it? Likely to be the Ministry of Health, but not necessarily. Especially we will see in policies, it could be the Ministry of Industries, or it could be a different particular manufacturing. It could be the tobacco thing on involved, like pharmaceuticals are not under the Ministry of Health. They are under the Ministry of Chemicals and Fertilizers in our country, the Department of Pharmaceuticals. So it's part of industry. Then who are the interest groups? For example, in tobacco, the big multinational corporations and the countries that support them, the US, where the European Union, the Japanese, they had a huge power and for a long time were able to block it in many number of ways. But they were facing both internal pressures from the courts and from other sources on that. But there were also civil society organizations. There were also academicians who were lobbying for it. There were also health groups that were lobbying for it. And remember, the People's Health Movement played a major role. I know that in 2001, before the WHO watch was set as it is now, I visited World Health Assembly, and we were part of the group, civil society organizations present, who were doing advocacy for passing the framework convention. So this policy came about over 5 to 10 years of negotiation as increasing evidence mounted that tobacco is directly harmful for health, and you could not any longer sustain a World Health Organization which remained silent on that. The legitimacy of that organization is questioned if it is not seen to be acting on tobacco control. And that can be highlighted and amplified by civil society on that. Now, the interesting question is that what happened in some countries, they are proud to say that they actually enforced a tobacco control policy before it. In many countries, most countries, tobacco control policies to align with the framework convention came after it. And in the implementation, different groups have different roles. For example, the advertisement against tobacco, there is strong criticism saying that if you put package advertisements on legal tobacco, illegal tobacco comes in. So the latest version is smuggling of tobacco happens because we have put so much taxation on tobacco, and therefore there is a pressure to reduce tobacco. So in the implementation, certain elements of the policy get amplified and certain get attenuated, and they do so at the behest of the powers. And therefore, one of the questions to be asked is, how effective is its implementation in your country? Is it actually there? Is tobacco, especially in our South Asia area, it's oral tobacco also. It's a problem we uniquely have. Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it stagnating? Even stagnation is good news because it has been increasing for a long time. And that is something that we actually look at a policy to understand. Now, the Doha Declaration is much more another major policy that we are familiar with. This is something we celebrate because at some point, this was a big win for a whole lot of international action on that. But I would like somebody to come in. I mean, if I can call somebody to speak on this. You can switch your mic on and speak perhaps. Jabindra, can you do you have an idea? You can click on this in the PowerPoint I've sent you and you can read it, or it is there in the next 2 pages. I'm going to introduce it also. The text is there. Can you give me anybody who is the custodian, who actually at the international level makes this policy? I'm going to call out somebody because we'll be waiting otherwise for somebody to answer. So I'm just starting with Jabindra because he sort of registered first. Have you any idea who is the custodian? Which international global organization is responsible for and adopted the Doha Declaration? Anyone? You can put up your hand.
I think it's World Trade Organization.
Deepika, you may have to help me call because of the screen. I can't see too much. If anybody's put up their hand.
He has responded in the chat.
Okay, he has responded in the chat. Okay,
TR says it's the WTO.
Yeah, the World Trade Organization, right. But in your country level, who is responsible? That's a tricky question, huh? I don't know whether in India everybody will be aware of that. So in India, it's the Directorate, the Department of Industrial Promotion and something. Okay, licensing on that. So it becomes a different, and Ministry of Commerce has a lot to do in this.
Yeah.
So it's not the health ministry. The basic point is the health ministry has very little to do on this, yet it is the most affected by that. So which globe? And this is important for us to know in a policy. And then we know who are the interest groups in this policy. Again, you can think about it. It's difficult to construct a conversation, but if you're writing in the chat, can you all try to put your thing on which are the interest groups that come into this?
I think the other interest groups are, for example, in health sector, definitely Ministry of Health,
Yeah.
and other private sectors also who are engaged in health sector. I mean the medicines or procurement or other parts of things. I think,
You
for
know, in
example, procuring vaccines or other equipments. I think these trips are also related to that.
So the point I want to make is it's not just the government. It's not just the government. In fact, government is sometimes more reacting rather than proacting. In India, there are two major organizations of drug manufacturers and drug
Mhm.
distributors, companies, corporates. One is called the Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers of India, that represents the international multinational companies. They are serious opposition to its implementation. Okay. And they come in the way. But there is another called the Indian Drug Manufacturers Association, which is actually very much, it's a quite wanting compulsory licensing. It wants the Doha Declaration because it represents its thing. They are against pricing, okay, but they are for they are against pricing regulation, but they do want patent regime to be flexible and to be relaxed, and therefore the actual resultant of policy is far more the interaction between the OPPI and the IDMA, the Indian Drug Manufacturers Association, and the Organization of Pharmaceutical Producers. And civil society works with the Indian Drug Manufacturers Association. Independently, it doesn't have. And the OPPI mobilizes a lot of academia in its support, but it basically, and legal support. Basically, it uses the laws of the court. So there are interest groups that are hard at work. And every time we try to implement any flexibility, there is a huge pressure from the US trade union, the US, there are corporate
Trade
groups of the
representative.
US. Okay. So this whole issue is issue. But how did policy come about at the global level? Have anybody any idea on that? How can somebody try to think of that? I've suggested a movie for you to watch. Did anybody manage to watch that movie? Uh-huh.
Sundar sir,
Yeah.
uh, regarding this Doha Declaration, and in
Yeah.
terms of the TRIPS flexibilities, I'm not that much clearer about what Doha Declaration actually is meant for, and how. Can you please briefly? It's very
So,
difficult to understand on that. A
so
little bit of declaration
I'll,
part.
I'll, I'll give you a little bit of background. The next
Okay.
two slides, actually, we had circulated it, and if you had clicked on it, you'd have got it. But here is a little bit of background. I know that many of you may not think. So here is the declaration itself. In 2 pages, I quickly read the declaration. So it says, we recognize the gravity of public health problems affecting many developing and least developed countries, especially HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, and epidemics. And we stress the need for WTO agreement on TRIPS to be part of a wider national and international action. So TRIPS is trade-related intellectual property rights. This is an agreement signed earlier that imposes very strict intellectual property rights, meaning that countries cannot manufacture the drugs even if they know to buy, and they cannot buy the drugs from any other country manufacturing except the companies that hold the patents. And these companies have a monopoly on it and they don't allow it. So the difference could be between, okay, it's $5,000 for a year's course or $5 for a year's course. The difference could be a factor of 1,000. So this is something that we will actually do this. Uh, then the other thing is that so here in the Doha Declaration, they say, no, we can make an exception if public health importance is there. Okay. And this is important, but actually the TRIPS already had that flexibility. But the adoption of policy reiterated that flexibility, meaning that if there is a public health emergency, you can go ahead and implement it. But there are a lot of conditions attached to it when maintaining so we should not. So it says this, the fourth point, we agree that TRIPS agreement does not and should not prevent members from taking measures to protect public health. Later, Venkat. Okay, and should not agree. And we affirm that the agreement should be interpreted and implemented in manner supportive of WTO's members' right to protect public health. So it specifically says, for example, each member has the right to grant compulsory licenses and the freedom to determine the grounds upon which such licenses are acted. In practice, if we come back to the earlier questions, how many have actually implemented? Remember this set of questions? Did we change our policy accordingly? How much effective is its policy? And the difference also, we must remember that Doha is a declaration, like Alma Ata is a declaration. And a declaration is different from a treaty in that it is not binding. Okay. And therefore, it's a declaration of intent, so to speak. And therefore, the effectiveness of implementation, even otherwise, even when there are treaties, it's an issue. The effectiveness of implementation is almost zero in most countries. But yet it made a huge difference, and it makes a huge difference on that. Okay. And this is something that we are trying to say, that in these policies, one really requires to understand that. Yes, Ashok?
Thank you, Sundar sir. So this is being kind of a new topic for me as well. But as we move ahead with the declaration and understanding of it, since we responded to the COVID-19 pandemic or even for the Mpox ongoing PHEIC in the like globally, so can you translate or relate the Doha Declaration and its maybe some differences it had made or some practical implications in terms of these global pandemics like COVID or Mpox of the recent one? Thank you, over.
Yeah, we will come to that again. I'm going to discuss the COVID one in some detail in a few slides. We're coming to just setting the pace on this understanding, the Doha Declaration. There is a movie that I have given a link to. Okay, it's on YouTube. It's called, Fire in the Blood. Please, later at your time's convenience, it's a bit of a long 1.5 hour movie. See that. It will give you a very, very good idea of how this was achieved. And I think that's a success story over here that you will need to see. But we will come to COVID-19 and see the problems of that. And we will see how we reacted, what happened on that. We'll just come to that. Just a few minutes. So now uh, I'm going to move on. All of this, which I was explained, was to explain that what is policy, and policy, how it impacts. Policies have even at the global level, have a direct impact on companies, and it is a play of powers, and it's very political on that. Now, if you were to formally be in a public health course, you would be taught a lot of theories of policy analysis. All these theoretical frameworks are sort of here or there. I mean, you need to take them. It is useful in some ways, but don't really go overboard in them. And very, very often they depoliticize this and make it into a technical discussion. So you can see what I was speaking now is explained in this Walton Gilson policy in another way. It is about context, it is about content, it is about process and about actors. So context is, okay, the Doha Declaration was adopted. What was the context? Okay, a lot of people were dying because of lack of access to deaths. There was a huge degree of protest across Africa. People were able to, powerful companies were able to ignore that protest. Then in USA, there was an outbreak of anthrax. When there was an outbreak of anthrax, USA itself had to apply compulsory licensing for a very ordinary drug called ciprofloxacin. The moment they did that, they could not deny the same right for other places. So at some point, the pressure built up. And there was also a change in governments, there was a certain mood, and it became favorable to adopt this. What is the content of it is what is the objectives. It relates to relaxation on public health measures. But what is a emergency which merits the application of a compulsory license is open, because that's the negotiation. That's where people have signed off. And how was the process made? So this was made in the WTO ministerial conference, the World Trade Organization's conference in Doha. But in some sense, it's supposed to be representative, but it was supposed to be converted into a treaty or a protocol, as they say. It never happened. And then the actors which were involved, a lot of interesting people were involved. From the People's Health Movement and across the countries of the world, there were huge struggles. Okay, in South Africa, in Thailand, and these struggles and these individuals had a role, but so had philanthropists like Clinton, so had different individual players or domestic Indian manufacturers who are willing to make these drugs. And so there is an issue on that. So there are other theories, which is called Kingdon's multiple streams, which looks as policies. Instead of this triangle, they look at problems, policies, and politics. And this notion of policy entrepreneur, which means anything like, some people set out to feel that it is their major role to change policy. Okay, a very good example is Lancet. Forever it thinks that it sets policy or it should set policy, and because it has evidence and others don't have. Or something like a Rockefeller Institution or Bill Gates Foundation, who actually says, the Gates Foundation says, we should not, our money has little impact if we give it to some village program or some buildings or construction. We have the greatest impact if we influence policy. So they see themselves as driven by policy. So there are different theories that explain that. And this punctuated equilibrium theory is also important, that it basically says that most times policies don't change. Then suddenly there is a window of opportunity or a particular context and a lot of changes occur. I mean, these are all interesting to read. I don't think we need to go too deep into them. It's much more useful to think of, but it's useful to think about it, especially when we come to writing about a policy. This helps.
Sundar, you've been going for 30 minutes, mate.
Okay.
But it's very good. Just keep going, but be aware.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. I'm not able to see the screen or the chat, so I'm a little bit handicapped. So I don't mind if you all call out and interrupt the organizers on the chat and the screen. If anybody puts their hand up, please interrupt me. I didn't intend to speak this way, but I'm not able to manage my systems on this. So let me go on this. So let's look at policy development. A lot of this is prescriptions for how policy makers should make policy. I have two problems with that. First, none of us are policy makers at that level. Okay. So why waste my time telling you that? But second, even policymakers never make it that way, because I've been on the policy table and it usually happens. Sometimes it's whimsical, sometimes it's crazy, sometimes there is a particular logic, sometimes they are trying to avoid something, or there is a political electorate has given a mandate that they are trying to implement. All sorts of things go into why a policy is made. So I wouldn't waste too much time on trying to tell you how policymakers should make policy. But I think that a policy has content, it has a problem or a scope, it has context, it has objectives, it has strategy, it has actions and agents, it has risks and assumptions. These are usually there. But when we are doing a policy analysis, we need to remember we need to do research or we need to study it. Like when I am talking about Doha Declaration, it's obviously an assumption that there is a certain background knowledge about the declaration. which isn't there. And now we are going to expect you all to help us with responding to the WHO next executive board meeting with your comments. And you will have to go back and read up about the topic. So, and you build the argument, the problems, the causes, and then you map the politics. What are the different perspectives? What are different groups saying? Who are saying different? Who are questioning it? Because if you don't listen to that, you don't get a cue. And then you build a consensus. And there is another thing about this policy work. I hope all of you get engaged in policy work, but this is the law of policy work. Thinking means writing. If you are not writing policy, writing, just orally articulating or speaking in a webinar, you won't get it. Unless you sit down and you write. So you write with a draft, and then people comment on the draft, and then you rewrite the draft, you modify the draft, you consult around the draft. The draft is important. Writing, I mean, it's the god of policy making. Not the policy is not speaking. All right about consultations, but if you don't have a draft, it doesn't go very well. People will say, don't give us a draft before, because then it leads us in a particular way. Well, my response is that if you're in policy making, you don't get led so easily. But yes, there are forums that we would have a consultation prior. I'm not strictly against that. But the point one is saying is write. Now, what do you write? When you write a policy analysis, you start by writing why now. Why? Why are you suddenly asking us about policy? Then you write a description. You know, very often if I ask, what is your objection to the global digital health policy? Everybody has an objection. But then I ask them, can you describe the global digital health policy to me? Most people will not know. I find that very disturbing. I find it is important to get the description of the policy, the scope, the content of it well expressed. Then you unpack the technical solutions. This is an important thing because technical solutions can be taken in a positivist way as if it is a given. It is natural. It is preordained. It is neutral. But science is none of these things. Science is not natural. It is not neutral. It is not preordained. It is subject to discussion. And there are types of knowledge that go into it. What is published in magazines and peer-reviewed journals is what I call epistemic knowledge. But bounce off this policy with your program managers on the field. They have experiential knowledge and they'll tell you precisely why this policy won't work. Talk to the community. And therefore, unpacking technical solutions is a process. It's not such an easy thing of just reading a review of literature like you do in a doctoral thesis and you get there. You don't get there with it. I find most often the second one, this talking with the people on the ground of, if we bring this policy, what will it mean to you? Very useful for unpacking technical solutions also. Then unpack the politics of the policy. Whom does it help? What choices, what context? Were there alternatives? What were the roads not traveled? How does it correspond to perspectives, especially on equity? There's the big one there. Will it affect everyone in the same way or will it affect different sections differently? And are we suggesting alternatives? What evidence supports this? So I'm going to take you through this in this PHM COVAX policy brief, okay? I hope I get this right. Yeah. Now we published this, PHM published this in June 2021. Okay.
Sundar,
So we start. Yes.
are you trying to project the policy brief?
Yes.
It's not showing. We only see the slide.
Okay.
I think you need to stop sharing and start sharing, and when you start sharing, pick up the policy brief.
Okay, I'll do that. Is this better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So look at this, a PHM policy brief unpacking the COVID-19. You were saying about COVID-19, this thing most guys didn't understand. Most government representatives, I have a contact with a whole lot of senior officers in the government. They couldn't get their head around into what exactly it was. And they actually used this policy brief, not necessarily that they agreed to the alternatives, but they needed it even for understanding what the hell this was talking about, because it's written in very inaccessible language. Very interestingly, it was even very difficult in this particular policy brief to define who was the owner of the policy. So WHO is not the owner, BMGF is not the owner. Who owns the policy was different. And the COVID-19 vaccines global facility. So COVAX is the owner. Who is COVAX? It could be really, really sponsored by most rich nations, global health partnerships, private philanthropies, and the pharmaceutical industry. Everybody was there. And we didn't know what the WHO was there. So we have what is COVAX. We have the systems context. And then we go into why a policy brief on COVAX. Okay, and we say that arresting depends on universal vaccination. Addressing the design failings of COVAX is critical to mobilizing around a new global strategy. Okay, so we say this, and just because the made important line is highlighted, policy briefs are generally written for people whom we think have a problem reading. So we try to put in pictures and we try to put in quotes. How is COVAX governed? How did COVAX plan to deliver affordable vaccines? What does COVAX promise? We're writing the promise. And what does it not commit? Okay. And just to highlight, so we have this thing over here. COVAX promises 20% vaccine coverage. Is that enough to stop the pandemic? No, but it's enough to get our vaccines into third world markets. So this is a cartoon. We highlight our critique of it, even while we are still engaged with the description. Look at it. It just took so many pages for the description of the policy. Why? Now we come to the critique. Now we come to the issue of why is this policy not good enough? This is the political analysis, and we start with the technical part of it, and lofty promises obscure design failure. So here we are talking of the technical area. So this a so-called technical area, how it is supposed to work and why it will actually not fail, it will fail to deliver this. And how it will remain, COVID-19 will remain an endemic, what happens? So for example, in India, AstraZeneca, the major manufacturer of Covishield, has now shut down manufacture of the vaccine. So if there is an outbreak, or even if there is some people who need it in a continuing way for whatever reason, how do you get it? And are the COVAX deals prominent? And now our critique, okay? And now the accusation. Lofty promises and implementation has been shaped by vested interests. Okay, there's much about it that is shrouded in secrecy. How have the interests of big pharma trumped the needs of developing countries? And then what actually happened? How did it play out? They promised to deliver 20%. They failed to deliver even 3%. But then the rich person is chortling that, look, how we disrupted alternatives and saved our property rights and made billions. So there were alternatives being proposed then. There were alternatives that were viable. Even this major AstraZeneca vaccine was manufactured with innovated with public financing in a public university. Gates Foundation went to them, they were offering it for free, went to them and asked them to negotiate it with AstraZeneca. After that, they disrupted any alternatives that were coming up. WHO came up with alternatives. Many countries thought, okay, this is, the rich countries are going with this, so this is more feasible, and therefore they plumbed for this, and they got cheated. But has it harmed the interest of LMICs? And then we come eventually in a PHM alternative to what are the alternatives to the problem of vaccine access and equity, and to realize in vaccines as a public good. Okay, I will list it out. What should we ask our governments to do to enable wider access to COVID-19 technologies, including vaccines? And we have first, it is called supporting the TRIPS waiver, supporting WHO initiatives to create technology. So it is from the immediate to the long term, okay, and to different nuances of it. So this is, I think, the point that we are trying to make in a policy brief on that. Okay. Can you see this now? Okay, I'm back to my thing, and I'm back to a thing. I'm going to skip this PHN comments on the WHO tracker. I have to make this last slide on policy intervention. Okay. One has to think about policy intervention, right? I like this famous thing from my 10th class in school. Give me a place to stand and I will move the earth. The famous Archimedes quotation. I like to think about, because sometimes we feel helpless. Huh? We are where are we standing? We are part of a people's health movement, like in South Africa. It has done quite a bit. In India, it can do quite a bit. Are we a civil society organizer? Are we an academic? Are we a service provider? I'm working in a USAID program as a mid-level manager for vaccination, immunization. Now, you asked me to interact with TRIPS waiver. How the hell can I do it from where I stand? Am I a program employee? The message I have is, it doesn't matter. Wherever you are, there are things that you can do. And it adds up. There is a tipping point. So interventions are, of course, they are more effective if we mobilize more and more peoples and organizations. Archimedes alone can't move the world, however long the lever is, because he'll have to stand somewhere on planet Pluto or somewhere. But he will need to actually build coalitions. Instead of one person, you will have to have many persons, networks, organizations. So the more who are pressing down on the lever, the more the change that should happen. And there must be clarity about what change we want to see, right? If we are, then the unity is better and the force is better directed. We must be strategic about where and when to apply the forces. I call that the fulcrum message. Where the fulcrum is, where you rest your lever. You know, if you are in physics, you will know it makes a lot of difference about where the fulcrum is placed and what is the nature of the fulcrum. And then there is a tipping point. It doesn't appear to move, but at some point it breaks. In our world, I have this quotation I have from the village in Bihar where I first heard about it. They say that, you know, this worker is breaking a big stone, rock. He hits on it one time. No, nothing happens, not even a crack. He hits on it a second time, no difference. Third time, no difference. The fourth, the fifth, the sixth, no difference. Seventh time he blows, the rock shatters. The question is not that it needed 7 blows. The question is, were the first 6 blows a wasted effort? Or did they actually lead to changes that you couldn't see, but it led up to the tipping point? And the tipping point comes because there could be a crisis in the existing policy. There could be a new government in power. It could just come because you are persistent and the other guys get tired of it. So we have a lot of examples in the people's health movement about how we move in policy. You can see in the center up front and agitation, people feet on the ground sort of thing. You can see protests happening in different way, policy briefs, webinars. So I don't want to list these off. Many of these is your lived experience. I hope we will share this in the exercise. But I'll take one example, the campaign for TRIPS waiver, only to look at how it is and what we call the EACT program, the Equitable Access to COVID Technologies program. So the context is this. Why? South Africa and India, when the COVID epidemic took place, submitted a resolution to World Health Organization and to World Trade Organization saying, we need a complete waiver of the TRIPS agreement so that we can go ahead and produce all the drugs, vaccines, protective equipment, diagnostics we know without bothering about it. Compulsory licensing and all is too complicated to do it in the middle of a pandemic. The People's Health Movement was already on to it. It had a program called the EAC program where it was actually mobilizing on that. So we decided to make the TRIPS waiver the fulcrum, the sort of resonating issue around which we gather support across the country, where you converge the different forces at work. Started by developing a situation analysis in 3 countries and at the global level. So that's the narrative part. Then developed policy briefs. I took you through one. We developed 3 of those policy briefs. And capacity building, training programs around it so that our activists could share it. So that is the commonality of the message and the capacity building needed. Then we shaped the public discourse. There were webinars, there were media articles, there were petitions and public statements, very often addressing the points that big business was raising. They were saying, oh, patents are important for innovation. I say, who said so? And why we don't say so? So shaping the public discourse and all of the above done with many partners. So we weren't doing alone. It was building coalitions. And then we were doing community monitorings and interventions in country level. Remember, the top 3 happens at the top levels of society, but we needed something to actually link with people on the ground. And then you had to link with local problems. I can't go to a village and ask them to come for TRIPS waiver, but they had a problem with getting access to oxygen when they were gasping for breath. And therefore, the link between these had to be shown, the problems at the ground. And that was done through a whole lot of strategies in a number of areas. And then, of course, direct advocacy. The reason why I put direct advocacy last is sometimes we tend to think that this is the main thing. And there are good groups who specialize in this, all strength to them, and we back them. But having said that, we're not all the people in this room who can do that. So lobbying with country administrators did help to become co-signatories or to support the resolution or meetings with globally. All of this also happened. It's not that it didn't happen. But because of the background that we had built up, it was all that more powerful. Some part of it needed resources. The EAC was funded, but most of it was voluntary. And this whole new nature of how you mobilize for a policy intervention, this is a good example. But at the end of the day, there is this big question. Did it work? The TRIPS waiver did not come around, or if it came around in a very apologetic, passive way for a particular amount of vaccines for a very almost made no impact. But then in major policy changes, it's not quite the question to ask. It's better to ask what worked where, to what extent, under what circumstances. In Indonesia, decided to become a co-signatory to the TRIPS waiver call, along with India and South Africa. So did Kenya. So did a number of other countries. The Japanese weakened their issues. The US government was brought under pressure. A whole lot of alertness was created on the issue of TRIPS waiver. The pandemic treaty negotiations is not a flip over, unlike the Dunkel draft and the TRIPS signing. The TRIPS signing, the developing world was supine. They just lay down and got screwed. But on the other hand, here, the pandemic treaty, they are resisting. They are giving it a fight. They're not going in. They're saying, we won't sign the treaty, but we won't sign a bad treaty. If it's a bad treaty, we just won't sign it. So it's very, very difficult to say whether our intervention matters. But even if you are weak, you can contribute to the shaping of the policy discourse because it happens at all levels. And you are, in a way, one has power. And, in some sense, it's better than standing over and again. So with these things, I really think that people's health movements have a long tradition of doing this.